It is 1892. A French military column is pushing through the forests of West Africa, confident and well-armed. They have fought across 3 continents. They have colonized kingdoms, put down rebellions, and marched through territory that no European army had entered before. They do not expect serious resistance from another African kingdom. Then the attack comes, and it does not come from where they expected. It comes from warriors they had never accounted for. Warriors who move fast, fight without fear, and who, when the French finally see their faces clearly, are women. The French soldiers are stunned, not because the attack is poorly executed, but because it is not. These women are disciplined, coordinated, and ferocious. They charge into rifle and cannon fire without breaking. They fight in close combat with a ferocity that French officers will write about for years afterwards. One French naval officer who witnessed them a few years earlier wrote that he had never seen anything like it, that these warriors scaled walls of thorns during training, ignoring the pain, and executed prisoners to prove they felt nothing that would slow them down on the battlefield. These were the Agoji, the female army of the Kingdom of Dahomey, the only documented all-female army in human history. And their story is one that the world is only now beginning to tell properly. Today I want to take you through the full story, who they were, where they came from, what they fought for, and what finally ended them. Because this is not just a story about women who could fight. It is a story about a kingdom that built something the world had never seen before and has never seen since. Let us start with the kingdom itself, because you cannot understand the Agoji without understanding Dahomey. The Kingdom of Dahomey existed in what is today the West African country of Benin, a small nation sandwiched between Nigeria to the east and Togo to the west. Dahomey was founded in the early 17th century by a branch of the Fon people, and it grew steadily in size and power over the following 200 years until it became one of the most influential kingdoms in West Africa. It was not a large kingdom by the standards of empires, not like Mali or Songhai, which had stretched across much of the continent. Dahomey was compact, aggressive, and strategically brilliant. It sat along the coast, which meant it had access to the Atlantic trade routes. And it used that access in ways that would make it rich, and that would leave a complicated legacy that we need to talk about honestly. Dahomey was one of the most active participants in the transatlantic slave trade. From roughly 1640 to 1860, the kingdom's economy was built in significant part on raiding neighboring communities, capturing people, and selling them to European slave traders, primarily Portuguese, at the port of Ouidah on the coast. At its peak, the kingdom was selling somewhere between 7,000 and 15,000 people into slavery every single year. This is not a comfortable part of the story, and it would be dishonest to leave it out. The Agoji, the female warriors, participated in many of these raids. They were the ones who swept through enemy villages in the early hours of the morning, took captives, fought off resistance, and brought people back to Dahomey to be sold. Knowing this does not erase what they were. They were still extraordinary warriors. They were still the only all-female army in history. But they existed inside a kingdom built partly on the enslavement of other Africans. And that context matters. Now, with that said, let me tell you their full story. The exact origin of the Agoji is debated by historians, because much of the early history of Dahomey comes from oral tradition rather than written records. But the most widely accepted version goes something like this. In the mid-1600s, the king of Dahomey, a man called Hugbaja, had a corps of female elephant hunters. These were women who were armed, trained, and skilled. They were not soldiers yet, but they were the beginning of something. Then Hugbaja died. His son Akaba took the throne. When Akaba died unexpectedly, his twin sister, Queen Hangbi, stepped in to hold the kingdom together. She needed protection. She needed a guard that was loyal to her personally. And so she built one from women. Women who answered to her, lived with her in the palace, and would die before they let her be harmed. Queen Hangbi's reign was brief. Her brother's heir eventually took over. But the female palace guard she had created did not disappear. It remained. And over the following decades, it grew. By the time King Gizo came to power in 1818, the female warriors were already a recognized part of the Dahomey military. But Gizo saw their potential more clearly than any king before him. He dramatically expanded the force. He gave them better training, better weapons, better status. He raised their numbers from a few hundred to several thousand. And he made them, formally, officially, one of the main fighting forces of the kingdom. Under Gizo, the Agoji were no longer just a palace guard or a ceremonial presence. They were frontline soldiers, battle-tested, feared by enemies, and central to Dahomey's military power. So, who actually became an Agoji? The women came from different backgrounds. Some were volunteers, women who chose the warrior life. Some were sent by their families, sometimes because they were considered difficult or rebellious, girls who refused to marry the men chosen for them, or who showed qualities that did not fit the expected role of a Dahomeyan woman. Some were slaves who earned their way into the ranks through courage and skill. Once they joined, their old lives were over. They left their families. They moved into the royal palace. They were considered wives of the king, which meant no other man could touch them, and they owed their loyalty to the kingdom above everything else. In practice, this meant they were celibate, disciplined, and entirely dedicated to their role as warriors. Their training was brutal by any standard. They were taught to endure pain without showing it. During training exercises, they climbed walls covered in thorns, acacia branches with long, sharp spikes, and were expected to ignore the cuts and keep moving. They practiced with machetes, rifles, bows, and in hand-to-hand combat. They were trained to move fast, strike hard, and not stop. They also trained their minds. An Agoji warrior was expected to control her emotions completely. No fear, no hesitation, no mercy that had not been authorized. There are accounts of new recruits being ordered to execute prisoners to prove that killing would not break them. The women who could not do it did not stay. The ones who stayed became something that European visitors, who had seen armies all over the world, genuinely struggled to describe. They wrote about them with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. Words like ferocious and extraordinary appear in account after account. One observer wrote that they were more dangerous than the male soldiers. Another said he had never seen anything like them in any army anywhere. And a war chant recorded from the Agoji captures their own self-understanding perfectly. They sang, "As the blacksmith takes an iron bar and by fire changes its fashion, so have we changed our nature. We are no longer women. We are men." By the middle of the 19th century, the Agoji were at the height of their power. Under King Gizo and then his son King Leo, the female warriors numbered somewhere between 4,000 and 6,000. That was roughly a third of the entire Dahomey army. They fought in raids, they led attacks, they defended the capital, and they took part in the annual customs, the great yearly ceremony of the kingdom, where they would perform military displays for the king, for the court, and for foreign visitors. They were wealthy by Dahomeyan standards. They had their own officers, their own command structure, their own songs, their own identity. They were not a unit attached to the male army. They were a parallel army, equal in prestige, sometimes superior in reputation. They also had political power. The senior Agoji officers sat on the Grand Council, the group that debated policy for the entire kingdom. And interestingly, historical records suggest the Agoji were often more pragmatic than their male counterparts. While the male military commanders pushed for direct attacks on powerful enemies, many Agoji leaders argued for raiding smaller, weaker targets and building stronger trade relationships. They thought strategically about what would keep the kingdom strong over time. The most famous Agoji commander of the era was a woman called Songhai. In 1851, she led an army of 6,000 female warriors against the heavily fortified Egba city of Abeokuta, a rival power with European cannons and strong defensive walls. The battle was a disaster. Thousands of Agoji died against the artillery. Songhai survived, but the losses at Abeokuta were a turning point, the first serious sign that the world was changing in ways that even the Agoji could not fight their way through, because Europe was coming. By the 1860s and 1870s, France was systematically pushing into West Africa, claiming territories, signing treaties with kingdoms whose leaders often did not fully understand what they were signing, and establishing what would eventually become the French colonial empire in the region. Dahomey resisted. King Leal refused French demands. His successor, King Behanzin, who came to power in 1889, was one of the most determined resistors of French colonialism in West Africa. He understood exactly what France was doing, and he was not going to let it happen without a fight. The First Franco-Dahomeyan War broke out in 1890. Behanzin's forces, including thousands of Agoji, fought the French to a standstill in several engagements. The French were surprised. They had expected a quick victory. They did not get one. They pulled back and signed a temporary agreement. But France was not done. In 1892, they came back with a much larger force, better armed, better supplied, with artillery that the Agoji's weapons could not match. The Second Franco-Dahomeyan War was brutal. The Agoji fought with everything they had. French officers who were there wrote afterwards about the ferocity of the female warriors, about how they charged into cannon fire without breaking, how they fought in hand-to-hand combat when their guns were empty, how they died fighting rather than retreating. But courage without matching firepower has a limit. France had repeating rifles and modern artillery. Dahomey had bravery and tradition. It was not enough. By 1894, Dahomey had fallen. King Behanzin was captured and exiled to Martinique in the Caribbean, where he died in 1906. The kingdom became French Dahomey, a colony. The Agoji were officially disbanded. The women who had fought were told to go home, to become wives, to become ordinary civilians. Some did. Some refused. Some continued to resist French rule in smaller ways for years afterwards. The last known surviving Agoji warrior was a woman named Nawi. In 1978, 84 years after the fall of Dahomey, she was interviewed by researchers. She was over 100 years old. She said she had fought the French in 1892. She died the following year, in 1979. When Nawi died, the last living link to the only all-female army in history was gone. Now I want to ask you something. Most of the world learned about the Agoji from a Hollywood film, The Woman King, released in 2022, starring Viola Davis. The film is a work of fiction. It changes history significantly and presents the Dahomey kingdom as more heroic and less involved in the slave trade than it actually was. Historians have criticized it for that, but here is what the film got right. It introduced tens of millions of people to the fact that this existed at all. That somewhere in West Africa, for 200 years, a kingdom built and maintained an all-female professional army. That those women were not a symbol or a gesture. They were actual soldiers who fought actual wars and scared the armies of one of the most powerful colonial empires in the world. That is a fact, not fiction, not mythology, a documented, historically verified fact that was sitting in academic papers and specialist books for over a century, while most of the world knew nothing about it. And it raises a question that I think is worth sitting with. How many stories like this are there? How many extraordinary things happened in Africa, in its kingdoms, its empires, its communities, that the world simply never learned about because the people who wrote the history books decided Africa did not have history worth writing. The Agoji are not an anomaly in African history. They are an example of what African history actually contains when you bother to look. A continent of complex, sophisticated, sometimes brutal, always deeply human societies that built things the rest of the world has not replicated. No other kingdom in history, not the Greeks, not the Romans, not the Mongols, not the British Empire, built a standing professional army made entirely of women who fought on the front lines for over 2 centuries. Only Dahomey did that. The kingdom is gone. The army is gone. The women who carried those machetes and those rifles are all gone. But in the Republic of Benin today, the country that stands on the land where Dahomey once stood, the Agoji are not forgotten. They are honored. Statues have been built. Museums have been opened. The oral histories have been collected and preserved. The country knows what it produced. And for the rest of the world, the story is finally spreading. Not fast enough, not fully enough, but spreading. Because somewhere in the 17th century, a queen who needed to survive built a guard out of women. And those women trained harder than anyone expected, fought harder than anyone believed possible, and held a kingdom together for 200 years against everything the world threw at it. When the French finally defeated them, it was not because the Agoji were weak. It was because the French brought cannons. The last of them fought to the end. And the very last one lived to be over 100 years old, in a world that had completely changed around her, carrying in her body the memory of something the world had never seen before and has not seen since. That is the Kingdom of Dahomey. That is the Agoji. Now you know.